All right, let's try it again, everyone. Sorry about that, about the technical difficulties. We'll call that in part one of the Fantasy Football Weekly, Week 11. Guys that you should start, sit, sleep, all that kind of stuff. Sean could no longer be with us. I think he's got something that we needed to wrap up in about an hour, and with the technical difficulties that we had, we just could not fit it in. So I'm gonna go solo here and still answer all your questions. I mean, I'm the one who gives better advice anyway, let's be honest. So follow my stuff right down here at the bottom again. I'm on YouTube, I'm on Instagram, I'm on X and Facebook and LinkedIn and everywhere else, on Spotify. Sorry about the technical difficulties and the issues we had. If you're going to join again, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Obviously, we are not a professional studio by any means with our own IT department and technical individuals that can fix stuff for us. So I'm not sure if it was on my end or his end. It sounds like it might be good on my end here. So we'll have to have a conversation later on to find out what happened there. But as a recap, let's just get into the recap here real quick. We'll go through quarterbacks. I know we were getting into the wide receivers, we were getting into the running backs, but do want to get a quick recap here just in case you missed the first part. Don't want to have you sit through all that fun stuff again. But here's what we had for quarterbacks. Our must-sits of the week, stud of the week, just as a recap, was Josh Allen. Fourth right now in fantasy football, just kind of depending on what kind of a format that you are in, going up against Kansas City. The Bills scored the third most amount of points per game. Kansas City has been living on the edge. We both kind of agreed when Sean was here that, this might be the end of the road for Kansas City and their win streak. And then we had Brock Purdy. Looks like everybody is back with Brock Purdy, obviously, except for Brandon Ayuk. CMC back there takes a little bit of pressure off of Brock Purdy versus Seattle. They give up the eighth most total yards per game. 10th most points allowed per game. So Brock Purdy was our second stud of the week. And then Bo Nix, who's, believe it or not, ninth overall right now for fantasy football quarterbacks. Again, depending on what kind of a format that you're playing in. Going up against Atlanta, who gives up the ninth most passing yards allowed per game and also ninth most total yards allowed per game. So coming off of a bad loss against Kansas City last week, I think Bo Nix is going to be the guy that turns it around the most and definitely the front runner here for Offensive Rookie of the Year. Our must-sit candidates, or at least my must-sit candidates, I think we were in agreement with a couple of these. The first two that we were in agreement with was Caleb Williams against Green Bay, or any other defense for that matter. Just get rid of him. The hype is gone. DJ Moore has given up on him. So you might as well give up on him too. He's not going to play very well down the stretch. And then we've got Anthony Richards making his, comeback of the season over Joe Flacco, who played poorly over the last couple of games, going up against the New York Jets, who give up the second least passing yards per game. That's not his strong suit in the first place. But Anthony Richardson not going to play very well. He didn't play very well in the first few games of the year. There's no reason to believe that he is going to have turned around just by watching Joe play poorly over the last few weeks. So I wouldn't start him along with any one of his wide receivers in Indianapolis at this point in time. And then our third one was Sam Darnold going up against Tennessee. Tennessee gives up the fewest passing yards per game, fewest total yards allowed per game. And of course, Darnold came out with throwing 3 interceptions in the red zone last week. Definitely not a guy that we're going to bank on at this point in time. So go ahead and sit Sam Darnold in their steads if you had either or any of those quarterbacks that you needed to pick somebody up. Maybe they're on the waivers. Here's our sleepers, and these are the guys that are outside of the top 12. First one was Jared Goff versus Jacksonville. I think he's going to do to Jacksonville what Sam Darnold should have done to Jacksonville last week. They give up the most total yards allowed per game, third most passing yards allowed per game, the sixth most points allowed per game. So Jared Goff, great sleeper outside of the top 12 quarterbacks in 2024 so far this year. Aaron Rodgers, who's currently 15th for quarterbacks, going up against Indianapolis. We mentioned Anthony Richardson before. I think that offense is going to stall enough to the point where Aaron Rodgers and that New York Jets offense is going to be able to dictate what they do there. And I think that they're just going to have their way with Indianapolis at this point in time. So Aaron Rodgers, look for him to put up some pretty decent points this week. And then Tua Tagovailoa, going up against Las Vegas. Yes, they did just come back off of their bye week. I don't think it helps at all. Same kind of a situation as what I just talked about with Aaron Rodgers against Indianapolis. Las Vegas does not have a very potent offense. Their defense isn't too bad. They've allowed the third most points per game, though, which means that offense now, which basically runs through Tua and A-Chain, they're going to get it done this week against Las Vegas. They are playing a lot better than they were in the beginning of the year. So those are a quick rundown of the quarterback situation. Now let's get into the running backs, which I think we got halfway through. I'm not even sure where we started to have the technical difficulties, but let's start all over with the running backs. And how I do this is obviously I break them up into running back 1, running back 2. So you've got your top 12 fantasy point running backs at this point in time. Who I think the best 3 are going to be this week. I've got number 1 is Alvin Kamara versus Cleveland. Cleveland, this is not the same, best defense in the NFL that they had last year. They have struggled a lot this year. Alvin is coming off of a midweek last week. I expect him to turn that around. I think he's full speed ahead right before their bye week coming up next week. And I think that they are going to be in a situation where they can get up on Cleveland as well. And obviously that offense all runs through Alvin Kamara anyway. So he's going to be a top stud running back for the week. Second stud of the week is going to be Joe Mixon versus Dallas. Dallas has the same kind of a situation. If you watch them play last week without having Dak Prescott in there, Cooper Rush is not the guy. He's not even close. And I'm sure that all Dallas fans have been bashing Dak Prescott, how he's not the best quarterback. He's not even a very good quarterback. You're all missing him right now. I believe that wholeheartedly because you see what Cooper Rush is doing. He's not doing a whole lot of anything. They're thinking about putting Trey Lance in there. Trey Lance was a forgotten kind of a quarterback bouncing around. San Fran gave up on him early enough. So I think what would help out with Dallas, we'll get into that later when we start to talk about Rico Dowdle and what his value is at. But with Houston right now, I think they're going to get out to a lead. A lot of 3-and-outs from Dallas last week against Philadelphia. I think Houston has a good enough defense to be able to do the same thing. Joe Mixon then at that point in time is going to be able to run all over this defense that gives up the 2nd most rushing yards per game and the 7th most total yards per game. Plus, Houston won't have to put a bunch of points on the board to keep up with Dallas. So you're looking at Mixon and a healthy dose of Pierce as well, probably coming into that game to finish out the 4th quarter at least. But Joe Mixon is going to get his before that point in the game comes. And then my third must-start running back for the week is going to be Breece Hall. We talked about Aaron Rodgers and how they're going to be able to dictate that game against the Indianapolis Colts. Breece Hall right now is 11th overall in the NFL for running backs in fantasy football, going up against that Indianapolis defense that gives up the 4th most total yards per game and the 3rd most rushing yards allowed per game. Plus, like I said, same situation. That offense is not going to be putting up a lot of points in Indianapolis. There's going to be a lot of 3-and-outs. There's going to be a lot of stalled drives. Breece Hall is going to take advantage of that. For my RB2s, these are the guys that are anywhere between 13 and 24. My number 1 favorite guy, we already talked about Tua, and I mentioned Devin Achane. That offense is going to run right over the Las Vegas defense, who allows the 3rd most points allowed per game. They've got their own issues at quarterback, whether or not it's going to be Gardner Minshew, Desmond Ridder, or whoever else that they want to put in there. I get that they're coming off of a bye week. It doesn't really matter. The Las Vegas Raiders are a lost cause at this point in time, and I think Miami goes in there and really, they're going to beat the spread, I believe, on this one, and they're going to try to make a late playoff run at this point in the season. So look for Miami to have a big day against Las Vegas. My second one is Josh Jacobs in Green Bay versus Chicago, who gives up the 9th most rushing yards per game. Plus, like I said before, there should be a lot of running against this Chicago club, who only put up 3 points last week. Green Bay should have this game well in hand early on, allow Josh Jacobs to really rack up over 100 yards in this game. And even if that's not the case, if miraculously Chicago ends up putting some points on the board, Josh Jacobs is never out of that game. He's always part of the plan. Even when Green Bay was playing Minnesota a few weeks ago and they were down by like 28, Josh Jacobs still getting a lot of passes out of the backfield, still getting a lot of runs. They don't give up on him. He stays in the game. So look for Josh Jacobs. It's a good game script for the Green Bay Packers this week. And then my third one is Najee Harris. He's 23rd overall for fantasy football running backs. I know he's going up against Baltimore, who only allows the 6th most total yards per game and the 8th most points allowed per game. Baltimore being the most penalized team this year, though, you can see a situation where there's going to be a lot of defensive pass interference, possibly in the end zone. It makes it a 1st and goal type of a situation with the Pittsburgh Steelers, in which case they are going to run the ball and they are going to use Najee Harris. They will use him out of the backfield as well. So not a great running opportunity for Najee this week, but I do see him actually performing pretty darn well against that Baltimore defense this week. My must-sit, getting into the guys that you should not play now, my must-sit running backs for this week. Mentioned Rico Dowdle before, or any other running back for that matter in Dallas. Not that there's any other running back that could actually do better than Rico Dowdle. I think he averaged over 5 yards per game against Philadelphia. When they get down by the goal line, they seem to want to use Ezekiel Elliott down there, who fumbles the ball. It's a hot mess, but that's not the real problem at this point, because Rico Dowdle has solidified himself as the running back number 1 in Dallas. The problem is their quarterback situation, which I already mentioned. The best case scenario for Rico Dowdle at this point in time is if Trey Lance gets the start at quarterback, and they have to use it almost as a dual threat. Is he going to run? Is he going to pass? I think that frees up a few more options for Rico. So before that really happens now, though, you're probably going to want to sit Rico Dowdle. It's not going to end well versus Houston, who has the opportunity to put up a lot of different points. They allow the 3rd fewest total yards per game to their opponents. And really, regardless if it was Houston or anybody else, any defense will surely play the run just to shut down Dowdle and then try to force whichever quarterback is in there to win games, or at least make it competitive at that point in time. My second must sit, he's 15th overall for fantasy football running backs, is Chase Brown, going up against that Los Angeles Chargers defense that's allowed the fewest points per game and the 6th fewest total yards per game. I don't think this is going to be a real great opportunity for Chase Brown. Same kind of a situation where the Chargers defense is really good against the run. They're going to focus on Chase Brown, not let him beat them out of the backfield, make Joe Burrow actually beat him, in which case, you know what, you possibly could. Obviously, you've got Chase to throw to. They're getting T. Higgins back. They've got Gesicki that they can throw to as well. So, but I think for what the Chargers can do and shut down against the Cincinnati offense, Chase Brown not going to have a very big day. I think he'll be lucky to break double digits at this point. And maybe my most controversial running back to sit this week is Bijan Robinson. He's 4th overall for running backs in fantasy football this year. He just started to really get rolling in the last few weeks here to solidify himself as that number 4 running back, going up against Denver that gives up the 5th fewest total yards allowed per game and the 7th fewest rushing yards allowed per game. And on top of that, they give up the 4th fewest points allowed per game. So it's not a real easy situation for Bijan Robinson. The thing that I don't like the most about it is the fact that there have been a lot of people that are bragging about how great Bijan Robinson is at this point in time. I think you jinxed him. I think he's not going to get into double digits either this week. And I get that Tyler Algier was questionable at one point in time during this week. Maybe he's not a factor at all. Maybe it's all Bijan, but I'm pretty sure that Algier is cleared to play. And Bijan probably not going to have the best time against Denver. I see Denver really going after the script in this game, coming out fast, scoring a lot of points. Don't want the same thing to happen to them last week, like what happened against Kansas City, where they are reliant on kicking a last-minute field goal to win. Denver's going to come out fast. My 3 best sleepers that I can recommend that you play this week, sticking with Denver, Audric Estime for Denver versus Atlanta, who allows the 9th most total yards per game. And Estime has shown some explosiveness when he has played. He's now the RB1. It's not Javonte Williams anymore. They've taken him out. He did mediocre at best. Now they've got Estime in there. A lot more firepower, a lot higher ceiling for Estime to run in that offense, that Sean Payton offense that he's used to running against or when he was the coach in New Orleans. So look for Estime. I'd put him in this week. I think he's going to have a big week. And then we've got Nick Chubb for Cleveland going up against New Orleans, who gives up the 5th most total yards per game, the 6th most rushing yards allowed per game, and then the 9th most points allowed per game. I think this is a good game for Nick Chubb. They're coming off their bye week. He gets a week to rest. I'm sure that's really important for him coming off of the injuries. You've got to deal with Jameis Winston as the quarterback right now, who loves to throw the ball away. And as we saw, not last week, but the week before, he's throwing too many interceptions. He should have had about 3 interceptions against Baltimore when they played. He did throw 3 interceptions the week later, and then they had their bye week. So they're probably going to take a little bit off of his plate, give it to Nick Chubb. He can run, he can catch, he can do all those good things. So look for him to be a great sleeper this week. And then my 3rd sleeper this week is going to be kind of a combination CMC, Christian McCaffrey, or a Jordan Mason versus Seattle. Christian McCaffrey came out last week and he looked really good, right? He got more carries. He had more playing time than I think most people thought he was going to get. He's still banged up, though. He's questionable. I'm sure he will be every week going forward through the rest of this season. But just keep your eye on that. If it's CMC or if it's Jordan Mason, either one versus Seattle will have a good day against that defense. Moving along from the running backs, which I think we got through at the part 1 segment, wide receivers. Here's my no-brainers, biggest opportunity wide receivers that you can play this week. Not that you're not going to start any of these, but you should really just kind of feel happy that you have these guys on your team. You can expect big things from these guys. Number one is going to be Garrett Wilson. I keep beating this New York Jets. I think that they're going to have a big day against the Indianapolis Colts. Indy, like I mentioned before, they give up the 4th most total yards allowed per game, the 6th most passing yards allowed per game. Sleeper status for Aaron Rodgers. I think Breece Hall is going to have a good game. I think Garrett Wilson's going to have a good game. Devontae Adams is a little banged up, questionable on whether he's going to play or not, which makes him the number 1 target there. Garrett Wilson, number 3 overall. Again, depending on, I'm talking about, it's in a 0.5 PPR league, but number 3 overall for wide receivers this year. My second must start, Drake London. I feel like I'm saying his name almost every week. He is 5th for wide receivers this year, going against Denver. Now, I just mentioned that Denver's going to have a good day. I think they're going to have to throw. Atlanta's going to have to throw against that Denver defense that typically shuts down the running game. They don't give up a lot of points. They're 4th. They give up the 4th fewest points per game, Denver does, which is why I think this is going to become kind of a shootout. You're going to see a lot of passing from Kirk Cousins, maybe less Bijan, why I don't think he's going to do very well this week. Somebody's going to have to pick up the slack, and I think that is Drake London. Nothing here says to go with Drake, and that's part of the reason why I like it. I think he's going to fly under the radar here for fantasy football owners, but I like him this week. I think he's going to have a monster week. My third must start of the week is Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's currently 7th right now for wide receivers, going up against Jacksonville, who allowed the 3rd most passing yards per game and the 6th most points allowed per game. Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to show you what Justin Jefferson should have done against Jacksonville last week. He's got a better quarterback in Detroit than what Minnesota does. So Jared Goff going to get the ball out to Amon-Ra St. Brown. Jared Goff, again, one of my sleeper picks for a quarterback this week. I think his main target is going to be Amon-Ra, and they're going to exploit that Jacksonville defense, especially with Jacksonville having Mac Jones in there. They're not going to be able to keep up that well. But Detroit really just does not care. If you've seen any of their games this year, when they get out to a big lead, you think that they're just going to, stop passing. They're going to continue to run with Montgomery and Gibbs. They don't. They continue to throw the ball. Amon-Ra St. Brown, big game for him coming up this week. My wide receiver 2, and these are the guys that are currently ranked between 13 and 24. The biggest one that I have in here that might be a shocker is Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's currently 14th right now for wide receivers, and I get the fact that was without DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf is now back, right? So this should relegate Jackson Smith-Njigba back down to a wide receiver 3. Versus San Fran, even with DK back in the lineup, I feel like this is a must-win already for Seattle to regain some confidence that they had in the beginning of the year, and now you're starting to see that kind of falter in that whole NFC West division. And obviously, this is against a division rival, San Francisco. So the last time the JSN played against San Francisco, he had 5 receptions on 9 targets, which was only second to DK Metcalf. He only had 53 yards. I think that changes this time. DK's coming back. Like I said, is he 100%? Is he 90%? Is he 80%? I still like JSN here. This time, I think he goes over 100 yards and he gets a touchdown this week against San Francisco. My second wide receiver, number 2, Courtland Sutton. Saying a lot of weird names, but Courtland Sutton, keep him in your starting lineup versus Atlanta. That defense gives up is ninth worst in both total yards allowed per game and passing yards allowed per game. So I think with that Audric Estime in there, Bo Nix is playing very well. I think Courtland Sutton is going to have a game as well. Very quietly, Courtland Sutton is 16th overall for wide receivers, and I don't think a lot of people appreciate that at this point in time. They're looking at Courtland Sutton as maybe a third option. I would stick him in your starting lineup if you've got him over most of these other wide receivers at this point in time. And my third wide receiver, number 2, should come as no surprise. George Pickens is 18th overall for Pittsburgh, going up against Baltimore, who has allowed the most passing yards per game and the 8th most points allowed per game. And if they match Brandon Stevens up on George Pickens this week, the Ravens are going to have a long day. If they can combine him with, Marlon Humphrey or really anybody else, they might be able to shut down George Pickens. I don't think so at this point in time. I think they're going to put Pickens up against Stevens, and he's going to have a huge game. 18th overall. Look for George Pickens. Stick him in your lineup. Put him in at least as a flex if you've got him there. Wide receivers that you can go ahead and sit for this week. I've got a bunch of them. I don't even have one individual wide receiver that you should start. I have groupings of wide receivers that you should start. If you didn't get this from what I've already said about the quarterback situation and the running back situation, number one, any wide receiver on the Colts, go ahead and put him on the bench. I don't care who it is. Pittman, Pierce, Downs, doesn't matter. The Jets allow the second fewest passing yards per game, and Anthony Richardson is back at being the starting quarterback for the Colts. So forget it. Scrap them. It's a wait-and-see type of situation. Just let those guys go. Quarterback situation in Indy went from bad to ugly real quick. Number two, another grouping of wide receivers that you can no longer trust is any wide receiver on the Chicago Bears, especially DJ Moore, who doesn't want to be there anymore. That's quite obvious. They're going up against Green Bay, who doesn't have anything really special about their defense. It's just that Caleb Williams is proving that he's not a very good quarterback. I've already put DJ Moore on my bench. I don't think I'm going to start him at all for the remainder of the year. The guys that I'm starting ahead of him are Terry McLaurin, Deebo Samuels, which I rightly should. But then I've also put Calvin Ridley ahead of him, Quentin Johnson ahead of him, Cedric Tillman ahead of him. I wouldn't start any of these. I wouldn't start DJ Moore over any of these guys at this point in time. He's just not worth it. He's not worth the frustration. Number three, any wide receiver that's currently on Jacksonville. Brian Thomas Jr. is banged up. He's just a rookie. Even if he does come back and play, keep that in mind. He is just a rookie. He cannot carry this offense. He cannot carry a Mac Jones-led offense. He can't be expected to carry Mac Jones. Gabe Davis is also banged up. So it's just not a good situation for Jacksonville. They're going up against Detroit. They're going to have a pass a lot. You figure somebody's going to be the beneficiary here, but I always kind of keep in mind, look what happened with Dallas and Philadelphia last week. Somebody was going to be the beneficiary, right? Well, not if Cooper Rush can't get you the ball. No wide receiver is going to thrive in that offense if they don't get the ball thrown to them. So instead of starting any one of those wide receivers that I mentioned on any one of those three teams, here are your sleepers for the week. I already mentioned him. Quentin Johnson, he's 45th overall for wide receivers, going up against Cincinnati. I already said you might want to bench Chase Brown because here's the scenario. Cincinnati allows the 10th most passing yards per game, the 6th most points allowed per game. So they're going to get out to a pretty decent lead. I think this is going to be more of a shootout game than it is a running game. And what we've seen from the LA Chargers recently is that they're not afraid as what people thought they were going to be in the beginning of the year when they had J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. They're not becoming afraid to pass the ball. Quentin Johnson had a very good game last week. I think this game is going to be more of a shootout than what people think. So Quentin Johnson, if he's on your bench, go ahead and put him in and feel good with that. Second one is Jerry Jeudy. I already mentioned the whole Cleveland situation here versus New Orleans. I like Nick Chubb in this kind of a situation. I like Jerry Jeudy also. New Orleans does not have a great defense. They've allowed the 4th most total yards per game, the 5th most passing yards allowed per game, and Cleveland just came off their bye week. So I hope that they work with Jameis Winston a little bit more, keep those interceptions down, but it's not going to stop him from throwing the ball over the field. And I think the one beneficiary there is Jerry Jeudy. Might even be Cedric Tillman. I'm flirting with putting him in as my flex guy this week. So anybody in that offense who's a wide receiver, they're rested up. They might be a little bit better against that New Orleans team. They're going to have to put up big points because, like I said, I think Alvin Kamara runs all over the place in that game. So they're going to be passing. My third one is Demario Douglas. He's currently 58th overall for wide receivers versus the LA Rams because, again, I think the Rams are just going to get way too far ahead of the Patriots and force them to pass. Now that the Rams are kind of full steam ahead with Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, Kyren Williams, they've got Matthew Stafford. They're going to be putting up a lot of points in this game. New England, this is not going to be an easy game like going up against the Chicago Bears last week, which they put up almost 20 points on them. They're going to have to pass the ball around a little bit more. I think Demario Douglas is the sole beneficiary. Hopefully we get to see a little bit more out of Drake May and his progression of being a rookie this year. But I think Demario Douglas as a sleeper has a very beneficial day against that LA Rams defense, which is not very good, and they'll have to throw against. So skipping along right through the wide receivers, let's get into the tight ends. George Kittle is my favorite tight end this week. Obviously, he is number 1 overall for tight ends in fantasy football if he plays versus Seattle. He is listed as questionable right now. Seattle allows the 8th most total yards per game and the 10th most points per game and the 12th most yards per game to tight ends. So very beneficial for George Kittle, as always. My second favorite tight end of the week is going to be Kyle Pitts. He is number 6 overall for tight ends, going up against Denver because I'm going against him. And that's basically the reasoning why he's going to dominate this week is because I'm playing against Kyle Pitts. So you can expect him to have at least 20 points this week. That's just the luck that I've got. He's number 6 overall for tight ends. And then we've got Tucker Kraft, who's number 7 versus Chicago. Again, Green Bay is not going to have to throw deep this weekend to keep up with Chicago's terrible offense. But when they do pass, they can, and when they do need to throw, they can play it safe. They can check down. Jordan Love can go to Kraft. Chicago gives up the 3rd most yards allowed to tight ends, so it's a safe play to say that Tucker Kraft will have a pretty decent week this weekend. Here's my must sits, and this is going to maybe surprise some people. It's the first time that I've ever mentioned him in a must sit situation, and that is Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers coming off of a bye week. He's 2nd overall for tight ends still, even after coming off of his bye week. He's only 2nd to George Kittle, going against Miami, who gives up the 8th fewest passing yards allowed per game, 7th fewest passing yards to tight ends. I know that Las Vegas is coming off their bye week. They've had some extra time to prepare, but they're going to screw this up too. Whether it's Gardner Minshew, whether it's Desmond Ridder, it doesn't matter what quarterback that they're going to put in there. I don't think Brock Purdy comes out and has a bang-up game like everybody expects him to. Number 2 is going to be Jake Ferguson with Dallas, and I think we've already explained why. It's because their quarterback situation is awful. They're going up against Houston, and it really wouldn't matter who they're playing against because the quarterback play is so bad that it actually could get Mike McCarthy fired after this weekend if they don't pull off some kind of a win or at least make it close. So really just don't play anybody in Dallas until further notice. I've got CeeDee Lamb in one of my leagues, and I'm putting him on the bench. That's how bad it is in Dallas right now. My 3rd must-sit is Evan Engram, who it's another shocker, I know, but he's actually only 22nd overall for tight ends. For a guy that gets thrown to a lot, he's sure not getting a whole lot of production out of it. Might be in part because he's got Mac Jones at quarterback. And going up against Detroit, who gives up the 2nd fewest yards to tight ends this year, is just not a great combination. So I would keep Evan Engram on your bench. Go with one of these sleepers instead. I'm hitting that New York Jets drum one more time for Tyler Conklin. He's 21st overall as a sleeper, barely in a tight end 2 kind of conversation at this point, but versus Indy, who allows the 6th most passing yards to tight ends. He does have a very favorable matchup. Plus, like I mentioned before, Devontae Adams is banged up. He won't be 100%. So you've got Garrett Wilson, and I think your number 2 guy in there is going to be Tyler Conklin. So look for him to put up some big points. Another sleeper, I mentioned him before as well, Mike Gesicki. He's 13th overall, so he just falls right outside of that tight end number 1 situation. Going up against the LA Chargers, who doesn't give up a lot of yards or points, but I have a feeling that Burrow is going to have to dump these off quite a bit because they are going to have their defense getting after Burrow, and Burrow takes a ton of hits. If they've learned anything from the last couple of weeks, it's that they got to get rid of the ball a lot quicker, and that's where Mike Gesicki comes in. So hats off to him. I think he's going to have a big game for tight ends. Chase Brown this weekend. T. Higgins, not 100% either. Chase Brown, I don't think he's going to be the beneficiary. So they're going to have to do some passing there in Cincinnati, and I think Mike is the guy that you're going to want to have on that offense. Number 3, I keep having him in the sleepers, and he produces kind of a half-ass production, I guess, overall. Jonnu Smith is 18th overall for tight ends. If you've got a couple of your tight ends or your main tight end is on a bye this week, go ahead, pick him up. Feel safe to play him. As I mentioned before, they're going up against Las Vegas. They allow the 5th most passing yards per game to tight ends, but won't need to go long down the field versus Las Vegas. Miami won't. They won't need to really drive down the field to Waddle, who's been inefficient, to Tyreek Hill, who's been inefficient. So I think they're going to stick with that short game, and Jonnu Smith is going to be the beneficiary there for tight ends. Moving right along to the defenses here. My must-start defenses for the week. You got Minnesota Vikings. They are ranked number 1 in fantasy football right now, again, depending on what kind of a format that you play in. They give up the 3rd fewest points allowed per game, and they're going up against Tennessee, who actually scores the 6th fewest points per game. So the matchup is just right there. You got to start Minnesota in this kind of a situation. Was Will Levis a fluke last week? I guess we're going to find out if he puts up a lot of points this week. Will the real Will Levis please stand up? I don't think he's going to, unless he's getting picked up off the turf from being sacked by the Minnesota Vikings this week. Number 2, Detroit Lions, sticking with the NFC North. They are currently 8th in fantasy football. They give up the 8th fewest points per game, and they're going up against New England, who scores the 2nd fewest points per game. So this is a matchup in heaven. Detroit is going to be able to run all over New England. I just don't see them the Patriots having a very formidable counterattack when it comes to Detroit. So start your Detroit Lions, and then sticking with the NFC North for a 3rd time, I'm going to say the Green Bay Packers as my 3rd must start for the week. They are 6th overall, actually. So all 3 NFC North teams are in the top 8 for fantasy football defenses this year. They're going up against the Chicago Bears. We've already beat that like a dead horse. Go ahead, pick up Green Bay. If they're still available, play them against this awful Chicago Bears offense. Must-sit defenses. I'm going to say my number one must-sit defense is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Not saying it just because I'm a Ravens fan. They are 7th overall as far as defenses, but Baltimore scores the most points per game. So I think you can probably leave the Steelers on the bench this week. And while this game is usually a defensive battle in the AFC North, one of the more exciting games that you can watch in a given weekend, this time I think it's going to be more exciting offensively. I think there's going to be a lot more fireworks. I think you're going to see a game a little bit more like the Baltimore-Cincinnati game, where they're both going to get up 30-plus points maybe on each side. So I wouldn't start the Pittsburgh defense this week. Another defense I wouldn't start this week, Chicago. Going up against Green Bay. And again, it's purely just because their offense is stagnant. They're going to be a lot of 3-and-outs. They're not going to put up a whole lot of points. They might not get out of the single-digit points again, which is going to allow Green Bay to dictate the game, run out the clock, score a lot of points at will. So Chicago, keep them on your bench. They are 5th overall in fantasy football. And then 4th overall in fantasy football is the LA Chargers versus Cincinnati, who scores the 6th most points per game. It's just a dangerous play when you've got a defense like this. It's almost like the Pittsburgh. Right? They're a top 7 defense in fantasy realms, and you got to stop playing them this week. You got to put them on your bench because they're going up against a team that scores the most points. Same kind of a situation with the LA Chargers going against the Cincinnati Bengals, who, like I said, they get T. Higgins back. I think the Chargers end up shutting down that run game, but the passing game is excellent as well. So I don't think it's a very good idea you start with the Chargers. If you have one of those defenses and you're wondering, well, who do I start now? Here's some good ones for you. Number one is I would start the New Orleans Saints. They are currently 16th overall in fantasy football. They're going up against the Cleveland Browns, who, yes, they are coming off the bye week, but they also score the 4th fewest points per game. And has Winston throwing the ball all over the place, he'll likely, or I should say they, as in the New Orleans Saints, will likely get some points from turnovers, possibly 4 to 8 points just on interceptions alone. So New Orleans, you can count on them to get you some decent points this week. Second sleeper team, and the last time that I'll mention them because we're talking about defenses, but I think I've mentioned them in almost every category this week. The New York Jets, who are 18th overall for a defense in fantasy football, going against the Indianapolis Colts, which is a no-brainer. We've already talked about them and Anthony Richardson not being able to put up points. A lot of sacks there, a lot of interceptions there. You could even get some fumble recoveries, maybe even a touchdown. I think the Jets are going to have one of the better weeks out of any defense in fantasy football this week. My third sleeper, Tennessee Titans. Yes, they are that bad, but they are that good this week. The Tennessee Titans are ranked 28th for fantasy football defenses, going up against Minnesota this week. And I say Tennessee because Darnold looked really, really bad last week. And I think he has the potential to throw 3 more picks this week versus Tennessee. They seem to get turnovers very well. They just don't seem to stop anybody from scoring that much. So you've got Tennessee versus Minnesota. I like Tennessee in this kind of a situation. I think their offense is just good enough to keep Minnesota on their heels for the most part. But Tennessee, look for them to be a sleeper team. I'd pick them up. They're 28th. They should be available in your fantasy football league. Once again, if you have any fantasy football questions, I would say go ahead and go to X. That's where I answer most of the questions. Look me up there. Follow me. Ask me. I will get to you as soon as I possibly can. I'm also on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Spotify, LinkedIn, everywhere else. So please hit me up there. Follow along. If you've got any questions about your fantasy football matchups on week 11, I will try to get to all of them. Good luck to everyone except for my opponent this week. I hope you lose and fall flat on your butt. Otherwise, good luck to everyone else out there, and I wish you well. Happy fantasy football.